Thank you. Thank you very much for coming this evening, and a welcome to everyone who's online. We have 19 participants on Zoom, so thank you very much for attending. So first of all, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mrin, and she's a long-standing fellow and was one of the organisers of the Jaipur Study Day we had in September last year, for those of you who came. Presently, she is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow, Royal Holloway, having completed her PhD last year at Cambridge, and was for 15 years, I think, curator at the City Palace Museum in Jaipur. So she's very well qualified to talk about museums and partition and identity. And I think that was related to your thesis as well. I remember reading it. so I'm going to hand over to you, and thank you very much. So if we can all give her a big welcome.
Thank you, Alison, for the introduction and the invitation. And thank you all for coming, both in person and online. I can't take curatorial credit completely for Jaipur because it's a team of us who works there. But yes, I have been working there for over a decade. Right, so let's jump straight in. Don't worry about it, I can see. Okay, thank you. If by studying colonial museums, we've uncovered the workings of the colonial state, what might we learn about the post-colonial nation state and its subsidiaries from examining its museums? This is the broad question to which I hope to provide one partial and particular answer by focusing on the mechanisms and rationale behind the collecting drive for post-partition East Punjab's museums. I should clarify that in what follows, I use the terms colonial and post-colonial in a chronological sense. I mean, because although celebrated as a definitive moment of change, 14th or the 15th of August, depending on whether you were in Pakistan or India, marked the start of a lengthy and muddy process, entanglement. It was not like turning on or off a switch. The partition of the Indian subcontinent into the nation states of India and Pakistan catalyzed one of the largest displacements of people known in history. And its aftermath continues in many forms today, most noticeably in the fractious political relationship between those two countries. And I'm sure the details of partition will be familiar to some, or perhaps many, in this audience, both here and online. I'd like to highlight a few key points at this stage in order to set the scene better for what follows in today's presentation. The first is that on the eve of its partition, the colonial administrative province Punjab and Bengal and Assam in the east consisted of a British-ruled regions and princely states ruled by hereditary royal families. Indeed, the political map of India as a whole was a patchwork, and as you can see from the tutti frutti on the screen there. And of course, the entire map of India changed between 1947 and 1966, when administrative units, which were previously provinces or presidencies, were officially reorganized into linguistically coherent states. A lot of scholarship on language-based nationalism in India and the politics behind reorganizing internal state boundaries, which of course continues. Some of the work of people like Lisa Mitchell, Timothy Ramaswamy, Louise Tillen, these are the people who've worked on this most notably. And I mentioned this here to foreground the fractured and fermenting political landscape of the post-independence decades, which contextualizes what follows. The second point, which is connected, is that historical studies tend to foreground one or the other. So either the princely states or the British ruled provinces. And in contrast, in considering any historical question, I think that holding the entire region in the frame or using evidence from one part to interrogate the other, I think that's valuable and produces a richer history. But having said that, I will, I'm afraid, have to exclude that from the agenda for today, partly because of lack of time, and focus on formally British-ruled East Punjab. So just to explain what I mean by that, so you can see the red line on the map on the left, that's the partition boundary. And again, you've got yellow, so focusing on the pink bits on the right side of that red line. So that's, the whole thing is East Punjab. The pink bits are what were British administered. The yellow bits are former princely states. So I'm not dealing with those today. My third and final point here is that the experience of partition was vastly different across the subcontinent. Joya Chatterjee and others have just how large the gap was at multiple layers between the partition of Punjab on the one hand and Bengal and on the other. Indeed, the experience of independence as a whole was a mixed bag. My mother, who was 12 at the time, told me that she heard about it on the radio in her village in Kerala and had no idea what it was about. Partition historiography constitutes a field of scholarship over more than 70 years that has renamed the issues with regularity and reconsidered sources. You have the classic studies of high politics, the role of regional actors, local motions, the lived experience both of those affected by partition, bystanders, engaged with oral sources, the study of emotions, trauma. These are some of the new approaches that have emerged over time. And while efforts to scale down to develop richness and detail continue, there are reminders to scale up to situate partition globally. We consider cause and effect and high politics, the politics of minorities and the nature of group violence. And even larger are civilizational questions about the longer history of South Asia and the importance of working with other disciplines. So this paper forges new links into established disciplines, partition historiography on the one hand, and museums. It will demonstrate museums' seminal role as a site from which to write partition and more broadly South Asian history, rather than their being dismissed as memorials to and repositories of history alone. Most purpose-built government museums in India suffer from the perception that they are dull, dead, uninspiring spaces. Historians of museums and museum professionals too, some in government service, many outside of it, including people like me, bemoan this state of affairs, which is of course compounded when displays are indeed dusty. Yet, as we shall see, and notwithstanding some laudable recent exceptions, such perceived difference or apparent lack of it were far from the case in the aftermath of independence, at least in East Punjab. The developed museum in India and more broadly South in the form that we understand today and its European origins are by now established, from modest, if elite beginnings as collections of objects in cabinets to the more egalitarian space, in theory, of the university, and moving on to grand authoritative public educational projects of the 19th century. And we know too of the museum's conjoined career in metropole and colony, its central role in knowing, ordering, managing, and exploiting the empire for economic gain. And of course, then in justifying it by pointing to India's supposed decadence and the monstrosity of its art, we are familiar with this. And we've also been made aware of challenges to that perception of authority and control, contested readings of the purpose impact of museums, and successful adaptations of the institution to suit local purposes during the colonial period. Of course, it's also necessary to be alert to how the museum operates within post-colonial India and South Asia, so not just keep focusing on the colonial period, as more recent counter-histories have shown. And for example, Sheila, whose work I'm referencing here, she measures their success, that is, she focuses on the Lahore Museum and measures its success against local modes of consumption, for example, that involves more family, group sorts of visits and displays rather than your American ideals or models that are far from applicable, and that museums around the world have realized over the years. So this paper is one example of these South Asian modes and aspects of collecting, constructing, and consuming material culture of historic value in a region recovering from a catastrophic event. By the time India and Pakistan gained independence, the sentiment museums were a civilizational status marker was widely shared in South Asia. Not only museum professionals who, you might think would hold this view, but bureaucrats and the general public thought so too. And as this paper will reveal, the effort expended on collecting for them, notwithstanding the other demand placed on the East Punjab government in the wake of partition, was important evidence for this. Whereas Jonathan Gillis puts it, new nations as well as old ones need ancient pasts, and museums are best positioned to cater to this need. They were not just repositories for historic materials, but institutions channeled the power of antiquity to produce legitimacy and authority. The situation we're exploring can also be better understood by recalling that the Lahore Museum, previously the Museum of Undivided Punjab, had been lost to Pakistan. Its collections were divided in West and East Punjab, as were the assets in Punjab's libraries and archives. And so with the ultimate goal of creating a new museum for East Punjab, that is Indian Punjab, the collecting initiatives that I'm going to discuss today were intended to replace the losses across the border and to build back a larger, richer and worthy collection, as several actors phrased it in what follows. So the vicissitude of that process, the history of the New Punjab Museum, which we know today as the Chandigarh Museum, and how it relates to other regional and national collections, that lies outside the scope of this paper. But the goal instead is to examine the act of contributing to collections of national significance as a way to both assert and demonstrate that one was a citizen, that one belonged. In contrast, being denied the agency and the right to act in this manner, which certain refugees of partition were, constituted disenfranchisement. Scrutinizing little known or used archival sources, in this paper, I investigate how the post-partition collecting methods in East Punjab enabled or disabled citizenship, speculate on the rationale and motivations behind them. I won't have time to reflect on how these historical findings inform current debates, such as on decolonization and museum practice in the heritage sector in South Asia, but we can pick up on this during the discussion if there's time. The preservation of the relics of the past is an essential requirement of all civilized society, and a museum is a primary cultural need of a progressive society. East Punjab must not lag behind. So wrote B.C. Mitra, former gallery assistant of the Central Museum Lahore, and officer on special duty with the responsibility for packing up East Punjab's share from the Lahore Museum in 1948. Mitra felt the reasons were so obvious that he could refrain from expatiating on the need for a museum in East Punjab, and he moved on in his report to discussing potential sources that could yield a collection of a fairly respectable size at a surprisingly low cost. Those are his words. East Punjab's urgent need for civilizational credentials, according to Mitra, is the more telling because of the context in which his argument was made. The international bad press that both India and Pakistan received, and the Punjab in particular, as a result of violence which accompanied partition. Desire to redress it by acquiring evidence of culture, it on display, may well be what drove many of the actors in the story without their always being aware of it. For the museum he hoped to build, Mitra identified two kinds of sources, those of government. So this meant treasure trove acquisitions, reciprocal exchanges, extra coins, the surplus distribution of objects between museums, publications. And the second was sources that could be gifted or loaned. And at this stage, government sources also included East Punjab's share of collections from Lahore, which I've just told you about, which derived from the museum as well as the central record, all of which reached Amritsar by the end of 1949. But as we shall see, although contested and coveted in equal measure, as was the case with all the assets divided at partition, these collections were by no means the only, the most important, or even the most substantial source of East Punjab's historical treasures. By May 1950, East Punjab appointed the person who was keeper of government records, Dr. G.L. whom we'll meet again, appointed him as curator of the museum as well. So that paved the way for amalgamating the two institutions under the single Office of the Historical Records Office. That B.C. Mitra articulated a need for tangible remnants of a past heritage, and the legitimacy offered by museums is one thing. He was, after all, that was his job. He was tasked with recovering East Punjab's share of the Lahore Museum collection. But that others did so too in the midst of the trauma of partition is notable. Even more remarkable is the fact that it stayed on the agenda of local government, despite the enormous strain under to maintain law and order, effect partition, resolve innumerable related disputes, and address refugee requirements. The mechanics of how this was accomplished and their implications are explored in what follows. On 5th January 1949, Dr. G.L. Chopra, we meet him again, at this point he's keeper of records, received 2 wire communications. First was from Amritsar, with instructions to postpone his impending visit to Lahore, scheduled to collect Punjab share documents from the record office. The second was from the Deputy Commissioner of Jalandhar, saying that orders for, and I quote, transference of a large collection of a Muslim evacuee to this office have been issued. He also received news from the Undersecretary of Rehabilitation about, and I quote again, orders for transfer to this office of still another collection of a Muslim evacuee from Jalandhar district. In consequence of these wire communications, Dr. Chopra made speedy arrangements to attend to matters. How and why was property being transferred to the record office? Pakistan and India, that is Western East Punjab specifically here, had both established offices to take custody of evacuee property in September 1947. The original idea was that the office would hold the property in trust so that their owners could reclaim them. The arrangement reflected official recognition that many people might have temporarily moved to safe locations during the rioting that accompanied partition, rather than with the intention to permanently migrate to, the other dominion, whichever it was. But as several scholars have shown, Rohit De, Hemanti Roy, Taylor Sherman, Joya as well, this arrangement rapidly morphed into an institution and subsequently a law that served to dispossess the very people whose interests it was meant to protect. In addition, knock-on effects on bystanders such as overseas Indian Muslims with property in India, or parts of India that had nothing to do with partition but were drawn into its slipstream. This assessment remains valid, notwithstanding further work that has uncovered regional variations in how the motion behind such legislation worked, or the local factors that might have applied. By the time Chopra received instructions in January 1949, both East and West Punjab had, in competition, enacted amendments to the original legislation, while technically permitting the return of properties whose definition and scope had also been expanded to include cash deposits and the contents of bank lockers in East Punjab, among other things, to their original owners. In this, it became increasingly circumspect. Meanwhile, evacuee legislation was extended from those disturbed areas affected by partition to other sort of troublesome areas like Hyderabad. The evacuee property ordinance, there's a lot of legal stuff about the ordinances, but essentially the ordinance was promulgated on 18th of October 1949, and that was a step up from all previous legislation, geographic and legislative scope, because, to paraphrase Joya, that effectively nationalized at a stroke all property vacated by Muslims in India outside Bengal, Assam, and the Northeast states, and authorized the use of such property for refugee rehabilitation or other public purposes. So this meant that only the slightest evidence of a person intending to migrate was required in order to attach the property. And so it had far-reaching ramifications. And in hindsight, that's provided the means and the precedent for the Indian state to make a direct intervention to its citizens' homes over time. So the irony of the custodian acquiring and dispersing property that it was in fact established to protect is now recognized. What has escaped historical scrutiny so far is the nature of some of the property the office handled. So far, scholarly work in this burgeoning field of evacuee property literature has mainly dealt with immovable property. But as much as property and land, so assets like land, farms, that sort of thing, as much as that was a cornerstone of refugee rehabilitation and creating a new post-partition order, it emerges that movable evacuee property was no less important. More importantly, it emerges movable property worth having was not constituted only of cash assets, jewelry, raw materials, and other saleable items, which is the typical list that appears in diplomatic or legislative correspondence, but of cultural value. They provided the foundation on which to rebuild Punjab through cultural rehabilitation, to give it identity and a sense of history rooted in objects, even if places and territories were no longer accessible. This was a large operation. Evacuee property was, without shame or hesitation, classed as government property in the Record Office's list of sources. That the Punjab government was classifying the movable property of Muslim migrants as a government source as early as 1948 is extraordinary. Punjab's historical office began to acquire it even before East Punjab's share of records were collected from Lahore. That only happened in 1949. Within a month of all of the higher communications and all this hectic activity, Chopra recorded that the additional custodian of evacuee property, Jalandhar, had written of a large quantity of historical matter, so that's books and scripts, lying at Karnal, Kunjpura, and Panipat, and Chopra's office was asked to examine it, and I quote, with a view to bringing a portion of it which may be suitable and eliminating on the spot those portions deemed irrelevant to the archives. By the end of 1949, the office had inspected at Jalandhar, Karnal, Panipat, Rewari, Gurgaon, Amritsar, Ambala, Rohtak, Shimla. It doesn't matter if you don't know any of these places, but the length of the list does matter. The East Punjab government had not waited for or needed the sweeping powers of the Evacuee Property Ordinance of October 1949. By then, it had already decided or implemented a policy to appropriate evacuee art for public purposes. But it is a revelation that these purposes went beyond the recovery of the economic life in the province, which was supposedly the key thing everyone was focusing on, to encompass the recovery of its historical roots and thus identity. The spaciousness of the move is startling, and so is the discovery the East Punjab government considered the consolidation of historical material as important as managing the refugee crisis, which was known to be placing enormous strain on the province personnel and infrastructure. The desire for a deep-rooted and tangible past encompassing objects and records was critical enough to preoccupy both the minds and machinery of government. Historians of South Asia have not previously noted this drive nor probed its manifestations. And if anyone's aware of something, please let me know online. Chopra's hectic inspections were a direct result of the custodian issuing a notice on the 5th of February 1949, requiring all of his subordinates down to the district level to report on historical material within their remit in 2 weeks. It was a very tight deadline, and I've put the text up there because it's worth reading through in the original. I'll give you a moment to do that. I think it's quite evident the instructions do not leave any room for ambiguity. This was a government-sponsored project, and if further proof were needed, is anyone still reading? Should I carry on? Okay, still reading. Wait. If further proof were needed, consider the title of the file in which the letter quoted above is archived. In case it's not clear, it says salvaging objects of historical interest from the belongings of Muslim evacuees throughout the Punjab. It is also evident that at least the custodian and his subordinates understood that books, papers, and historical items constituted movable property. It makes absence from evacuee property studies till date all the more notable. Despite the Record Office's haste to secure items of potential interest, there were hiccups along the way. Chopra had to stay vigilant. He paid attention to press notices of auctions to ensure that his office was not deprived of old coins and the other spoils, or alternately, you could call it safeguarding historical objects, as he phrased it. Where was this money going and who was buying these objects? What kind of material, aside from books, manuscripts, or coins, was being auctioned? One could speculate that any official monetary gains went towards the compensation pool that the government of India created by consolidating all evacuee property, from which it proposed to recompense incoming Hindus and Sikhs. But this arrangement was only formalized in October 1954, a full 5 years after these events. So was the government of Punjab, East Punjab, running its own scheme? There are many unanswered questions about the imperatives driving the state accumulation of dispersed movable evacuee property at this time. Studies of the lived reality of the border in Bengal and the varied accounts of the experience of partition can make for harrowing reading, exposing the tremendous gap between an order and its implementation on the ground. Refugees were often made, encouraged by an ecology of fear and routine violence to migrate. Insidious networks of smuggling, corruption, organized crime, and violent militias were exacerbated by a solidifying border, especially in Punjab, that often resulted in people losing all their possessions before they could reach safety, and assuming they did so alive. Incoming refugees occupied evacuee property with tenacity, and the ferocity with which they fought for their right to remain has been recognized as a key factor that determined the government of India's decision to prevent Muslim migrants' return. It had already lost the argument on the ground and needed evacuees' homes to house incoming Hindus and Sikhs. So this has been described as an example of the ground-up shaping of the rights of citizens and a failure of the liberal policies and intentions of the two governments. Likewise, across the border in Pakistan, there were too many Muslim refugees for the new nation to absorb, and both countries needed evacuee assets to accommodate new arrivals. Scholars of the interrelated nature of evacuee property legislation between the two countries, it's often characterized as tit for tat. The measures grew more draconian and exclusionary. But the academic focus on houses and agricultural land, compounded by the loose intermovable property, has led to lacuna in our understanding exactly how quite so many books and manuscripts accumulated with the custodian of evacuee property. It seems extraordinary that gangs would have robbed fleeing refugees of books rather than jewelry, or that their victims were carrying them in preference to more practical or precious items. But we do know that for some refugees, books were a top priority. And this is from the Partition Museum in Amritsar, which holds in its collection of the Muraka-e-Chugtai, which is one of the few precious objects that Basant Kishan Khanna and his wife Leelavati and their children carried from Lahore when they had on 14th August 1947, thinking they would return. But refugee accounts seldom specify the possessions that either circumstances or individuals forced them to surrender. It's of course possible that researchers have not thought to ask or may have omitted information, thinking them unimportant. But it is evident that these acquisitions recast our understanding of the workings of this evacuee property legislation and the experiences of citizen refugees, as they've been called, and destabilizes the certainties that found regional and national identity. Accounts indicate that some people managed to return and retrieve possessions from their abandoned homes, sometimes enabled by faithful friends or because conscientious new occupants preserved them. In fact, the habitable property effects in one's house is one of the few ways through which temporary migrants could try and prove owner's challenge, although usually without success, requisitions of those house governments of India and Pakistan. In point of fact, India and Pakistan had agreed by 1953 to allow the duty-free removal of personal and household effects, barring machinery, machine parts, things like that, all of which could be either reclaimed, requiring a migrant to return, or sold within the country of original residence. But the anti-minority rhetoric that had been building since partition characterized such attempts as to shift capital, destabilize the economy, and thus anti-national. It's a word we hear a lot these days too. Movable property was redefined and imbued with nationality. Property which had hitherto been owned by individuals now came to be seen as belonging to the nation. Thus, in an ironic twist, their owners, a human resource, became unwanted evacuees and forced refugees. Their cultural resources became a coveted asset to rebuild and reassert regional and national identity. By and large, people moved in a hurry with no time to pack or arrange to move their possessions later. But there were also numerous cases of people from the better educated, informed, and wealthier classes being able to liquidate and transfer assets to safe zones, which of course just provided ammunition for this kind of national charge. But notwithstanding the fact that it may have chiefly been the poor and illiterate who were left to fend for themselves when prevented from moving in the national interest, the well-known case of lower caste communities, such as Dalits who were sanitation workers who were prevented from moving because they were needed to keep the streets clean. But notwithstanding this, there was enough material for the Record Office staff to go through. Archives have not yet revealed how large numbers of such objects were funneled through to them. Recent work on the personal objects that encapsulate partition for refugees and on the affective nature of partition reiterate the visceral impact objects can and have. Who were the people or agencies that bought and acquired the material rejected by the Records Office? What effect did the process of physical presence of these objects have? I mean, this is just years after a really traumatic partition, and you're still seeing what it caused. You're seeing it you. But these are, evocative questions, but they've not been considered. And while they lie outside the scope of our discussion today, they do bear further investigation. Studies of partition and state formation in independent India and Pakistan have noted the significant gaps between central policy and implementation on the ground. Indeed, research suggests broad continuities between colonial and post-colonial regimes in the gaps between the disordered character of a local reality and the abstract logic of governance. But this is not a question of one or two individuals making a common biased decision contravening government policy. Rather, the chasm between the mandate of a government office buttressed intergovernmental agreements and its implementation stands exposed. And it was deliberate. None of the files containing this information are marked secret, and the tone of the communication does not suggest any view to conceal. Chopra became agitated over auctions of evacuee property after seeing press notices. So it's evident that the information was in the public domain. Further, whilst scholars have noted Pakistan's protests that moves to attach land and houses and vice versa, nobody seems to have commented on public auctions of movable property. So was it a blatant disregard for orders? Was that auctions held in Pakistan? Was the custodian taking matters into his own hands, albeit empowered by a Government of India mandate? Speaking of India in this case, there is enough evidence to assert that there were mechanisms, rationales in place to collect and manage movable property in far greater numbers and variety than we have hitherto realized. The centrality of evacuee property to shaping both citizens and states in South Asia means that this is a crucial area of research that awaits investigations. We only still know the outlines and are yet to flesh out the details. By the end of 1949, the Historical Record Office had amassed, and I quote, over 500,000 files, 4,500 books, 400 manuscripts, 1,022 and 100 other documents. And the keeper noted with self-congratulation that this was a collection as good as found anywhere in northern India. And he went on to add that it was no longer a repository of merely old Secretariat records, but had rapidly grown into a central archive in which all kinds of historical materials, both official and private sources, were being received from all over the province and properly preserved. The attention to quantities was a way to make the connection with Punjab's past tangible. It also reveals the scale of the yields from evacuee property. For if the old Record Office contained Secretariat records alone, then given what we know now, Muslim migrants were the source of many of the new books, manuscripts, coins, and documents that Chopra listed with satisfaction. So in addition to their personal property being thus appropriated, evacuee individuals were rendered nameless and faceless. So Chopra's reports humanizes them. He refers to the evacuee dumps that he or his team visited to select and rescue many important items, which his office, of course, later suitably preserved, because obviously would not know what they were doing or that they were valuable. That's the assumption. The list itself, sadly, was not in the copy of the report that I consulted. So while we can't be sure of the detailed nature of these items, we should not assume primarily connected with the region's Islamic heritage or not. We can't make those assumptions. We don't know in detail what they are. But the overwhelming image, finding treasures, rubbish heaps, eerily reminiscent of Nazi concentration camps. Nazi officers routed through the garbage that was the personal possessions and the bodies of their victims to find whatever valuables they could claim heaped in dumps for the war effort and economic gain, public purpose in another form. But unlike post-World War II attempts to bring art collections to their pre-war owners, there was no question of restitution here. If property legislation as a whole has determined the way in which citizenship has come to be defined, particularly for religious minorities in South Asia, that's why it matters. And the sweeping powers and curious legal status of the office of the custodian, it was outside of the judiciary, they've cast a long shadow on the larger question of asset redistribution and certain citizens' right to privacy, occupancy, mobility, and movable and immovable property after independence. Over the course of this evening, we've established that the shadow extends even further to shape museum collections and the histories they're able to tell. But the full import of what this might mean requires further investigation. And these are not mere academic matters. Mechanisms acknowledge donors in Indian museums, which makes it even less likely that they will recognize the contributions, willing or otherwise, of nameless migrants to a foreign, usually considered enemy land. The discoveries outlined today have at least serious ethical repercussions for Indian museum professionals. Any attempts to address them will come up against the problems of how to rationalize this evacuee, later enemy property, as foundational to and regional identity. However, given that I've worked in museums for a long time, I'm quite, optimistic about them. They do also exemplify the tangible power of objects to forge connections between people. They do, I think, generally offer possibilities for reconciliation, at least at an individual level, with such a troubled history. And of course, there are numerous examples from our most locally, even within thinking of Northern Ireland, of art and museums being harnessed towards post-conflict resolution. So it remains an essential component of an international mandate for museums. So that's its absence in a South Asian context appears rather glaring, an omission. Private individuals in East Punjab, mainly Hindu, by contrast, had more agency. Their names appear in the correspondence, even if not if in report summaries. They often warranted files, so like the one I showed you, but it would have the person's name on it. And it must be emphasized, received compensation for their contribution to the collecting effort. The government mounted this awareness campaign, as they said, to rouse the people to a sense of importance of historical material they might possess. The press, the radio, correspondence with individuals, and personal contacts with them. All these and other means of publicity were employed to discover and obtain objects of history. Government efforts included advertisements in the leading dailies of Northern India, resulting in a wide response with several collections of books, manuscripts, paintings, and coins brought to the department's notice. And Chopra, in the name of the department, pursued, persuaded, and negotiated people to loan or sell using letters such as this one. It goes on to detail the uphill task that this constituted, listed what kind of material was being sought, and claimed the active help of the addressee. The keeper records hoped that their fine national and cultural sense would help them appreciate the nature of the endeavor and concede to his request at least copy materials. In one case, Chopra went to Delhi to examine a valuable collection of historical relics, as he called them, owned by a Sri Jena Singh, PCS retired, who had got in touch with the chief secretary. And this gentleman, Mr. Singh, in turn was successful in persuading another gentleman to show Chopra his old collections of manuscript books, and wrote twice to urge Chopra to come to Delhi to review them. And Chopra noted that, but for the fact that in several cases the prices quoted are too high, the actual intake of the list of items that previously mentioned would have been larger than it has been. Nevertheless, two big collections comprising 2,220 and 80 respectively, and a few smaller ones obtained at a total cost of no less than 40,000 rupees. These include out-of-print publications, hitherto unknown manuscript histories, sanads, jagirnamas, paintings, coins, statuettes. You get a sense of this kind of wealth of stuff. One cannot overstate the scale of the effort made in infrastructural and monetary terms. So 40,000 rupees in January 1957 would have been about 3 million rupees, sort of 30 lakhs today. And that's already a decade after partition, or around after the time we're talking about. So it would have been worth even more in today's terms. And again, can't discuss it just now, but at the same time, an Indian civil servant called M.S. Randhawa was also persuading the government of Punjab to set aside money to buy he considered were the finest examples of art from Punjab, i.e. Pahari paintings. So you really do begin to get a sense of, even if we don't have a tabulated list of this is exactly how much was spent on acquiring historic collections, you do get a sense of the resources that the government was willing to put into this project. We know that the Punjab national government spent millions on refugee rehabilitation, although it's often downplayed by recipients who, according to Ian Talbot, attribute their subsequent success to their own hard work and resourcefulness. So it's instructive to compare this sort of outflow on historic materials with what was being spent on refugees. So, for example, Talbot notes that 15 lakhs were set aside for small grants of 500 rupees to petty keepers. So that would have been 3,000 people. The 40,000 that I mentioned above would have represented grants to about 80 people. So while the total sums for spent on refugee rehabilitation and relief, which is over 190 million, obviously would outstrip what was spent on object creations, they do make clear that collecting was a priority of the utmost seriousness for the East Punjab government. A mere 2 years after partition, when violence had abated, demands on the East Punjab government were by no means over. It nevertheless believed in the importance of Indian cultural heritage over and above what it was able to acquire on the cheap from evacuee sources, and the department's reports attest to this. Describing the wide range of activities undertaken until the end of the 1960s, they make clear not only the labor and tedium that went into running and maintaining an archive, but the monies that the state was willing to disperse on collections, infrastructure, and personnel. The difference in the department's or the East Punjab government's attitude to acquisitions from individuals can best be understood by considering the ways in which states or regimes exercise power. And scholars in diverse fields ranging from anthropology to political science, art history, archaeology, a lot of people have unpacked the colonial encounter to demonstrate the rupture, change, and overarching forms of knowledge that existed in South Asia. And this work has highlighted the manner in which the colonial project rendered local subjects faceless and nameless. Individuals were reduced to an illustrative type or a cipher in the enumerative knowledge-gathering, world-shaping projects beloved of the colonial regime. Alternatively, they were written out of the collaborative ventures that most undertakings in truth were. Other scholars have pushed back against this to reinscribe native voices, agency, resistance, and subversion in the story, even whilst acknowledging continuity and adaptation. The point of rehearsing these arguments is not to take a particular, aside. I mean, both arguments are valid, but and the resulting deliberations have served to enrich our understanding of the impact of power by opening up a spectrum of possible interpretations. But it is the very shape of the debate that makes my point, which is that historians and curators regard the act of naming and crediting native informants as the appropriate way to redress the many erasures of colonial sources. Today, whether it's the Holocaust Museum in Berlin, the Auschwitz, or collaborative projects with source communities, undertaken by museums of university museums, whether it's Oxford, Cambridge, wherever, the overwhelming emphasis on identifying, naming, and therefore acknowledging individuals. So not only does the long partition continue, it does so in a way that we have not yet considered, situated part of the process by which East Punjab sought to reconnect with its roots, heritage, and identity in tangible form. The state in East Punjab dispossessed and rendered Muslim evacuees nameless by the way in which it collected for Punjab after partition, with no conceivable mode of redress. Those forced to migrate lost any claim on the culture and history that these objects represented, and along with them, their links to particular geographical or affinities. Although it reflects the importance of records to the apparatus of government, what else might explain the urge to collect? One motivation might be the fiercely acquisitive nature of national identity, contesting over icons or markers of heritage shared with others. Of course, exhibitions constitute a political arena in which search and contest definitions of identity and culture, and museums, which many of us will be familiar with, perform ceremonial and ritual functions. And Simon Nell in particular has commented on how museums constitute a space for performing the myths of nationhood. As he puts it, they're made so much more believable because we see real and authentic objects in front of us, not merely props. So for East existence to be real then, and the logic of partition and nationhood to be believable, it needed to collect. In addition to the compelling stage offered by museums, powerful local factors may have been at play too. And Murphy has explored, and I quote, the rich meanings of Sikh objects through which the past is experienced and proved, and history narrated and performed for a transnational religious community within a religious setting as well as cultural, artistic, and political ones. It's a wide-ranging analysis. Her work investigates Sikh notions of history and historiography, and making the point, which I mentioned before, that the compulsions of colonial encounters created novel forms of historical memory. In this is particularly referring to the Gurdwara reform movement of the 1920s, which required that Sikh identity and history be proven and directly related to the land and the Gurdwaras that the community was seeking to re-establish control over. This, of course, is the most famous of them, the Golden Temple. Essentially, it was a contest between the Sikh community and those who controlled these Gurdwaras, who were necessarily Sikh, who were supposed to be, who were in the pay of the British government. This caused lots of problems. We won't go into them, but that's essentially the context. And she explores the different memorial forms that the Sikh community harnessed in order to form that sense of community, and in particular focuses on the marking of Sikh territory based on the past. So this, she observes, led to land being turned into territory by being inhabited, appropriated, or recognized in some form. So I speculate that what Murphy characterized as a special Sikh notion of territory could spill over to influence how many Punjabis related to the land and how they imagined their territory, augmented by the bond of a shared Punjabi language. Murphy also notes that at this time, historical objects, because they were considered personal property, had a secondary role and importance and have only recently begun to attract attention for their historical worth and value as memorial technologies, to use her words. But if Sikhness, and maybe by extension Punjabiness, was so intimately entwined with territorialized place, I suggest instead that it was in response to the violent sundering and wrenching away from territory occasioned by partition and the consequent search for roots that historic objects value. East Punjab, then, may have been especially fertile ground for collecting. Murphy further suggests that the territorialized landscape of the Sikh past that was created was a museumized space for consumption of the land. She argues that this is illustrated by, if you go to a Gurdwara, there's a sort of tour museum sensibility that she ascribes to Gurdwara guides, and also the phenomenon of the historical museum within Gurdwaras. So, given this, East Punjab's denizens then had been prepped to museum in a unique way. As newly minted Indian citizens, that too on a frontier, it was thus perhaps natural for Chopra, his colleagues, and the larger public, unmoored by partition, to desire the opposite, to search for roots and a sense of belonging through an established past. Collecting or contributing to collections offered a powerful, tangible way to articulate citizenship, claim belonging, imagine East Punjab. This argument is rendered more compelling when we consider the practices of exclusion discussed today that were built into the system. Most refugees were dispossessed of their cultural heritage as they were of their claim to East Punjab as a consequence and in corroboration of partition. So, in conclusion, studies of the evolution of citizenship in Asia have demonstrated that it has emerged from a dialogue between the state and citizens. So you have scholars like Wazir Zamindar insisting that it was top down, or Nitshani, Joy Chatterjee made convincing cases for the individual and group that exerted pressure in the opposite direction, thereby shaping democratic institutions and legislation from below. And others have shown how the mechanisms of governance and their implementation mediated individual experiences of the state and the rights and duties of citizens. One of them is missing in action, Professor Ansari. There is also convincing evidence of the many nationalisms that existed prior to partition and independence in 1947, which offered alternate conceptions of what the nation could be. I alluded to this at the beginning this evening when I was having the political flux that prevailed in the immediate aftermath of independence. So, for instance, we often forget that although most of the princely states had agreed to India, several of them were viable units of the federation. In other words, have continued their existence as a state within India, as a state of India. So a good example of this is PEPSU, which is the Patiala and East Punjab States Union, which coexisted. That's the yellow bits in the first map earlier map that I showed you, which coexisted with East Punjab, and PEPSU was a federation of the princely states of Patiala, Kapurthala, Jind, Nabha, Faridkot, Malerkotla, Kalsia, and Nalagarh. And the two were subsequently merged, following which the region was then trifurcated into what you see today, which is Punjab, Himachal, and Haryana. And that happened in 1966. But while it lasted, PEPSU was a remarkable experiment for other possible national imaginaries, in the service of which the PEPSU princes did mobilize their museum collections. This remains less research and underappreciated. Although that's outside the scope of the paper, the wider subject, incorporation of prince collections into national museums, received at least some scholarly attention and thus partial acknowledgement. Although the princes group were considered leaders at independence and thereafter, there could not be a more sobering contrast between the comparatively respectful treatment that post-colonial museums accorded princely contributions to national collections, as opposed to the erasures and silence over those of fleeing refugees. When considered the insistent language of national independence and patriotic duty that the Record Office deployed when writing to potential donors, and as you saw previously, it becomes possible both to glimpse the anxiety to forge a collective identity for East Punjab, even if that was sometimes in contest with PEPSU's own efforts in that regard, and to see the process of participating in collecting offered a way to articulate one's citizenship, affirm belonging, and imagine the nation. Using nameless evacuee property for collection building was an act of disenfranchisement, denying citizenship, belonging, and the right to imagine the nation or region. Comparing pre- and post-partition figures for the Lahore Museum with those of East Punjab as a whole would expose the extent to which ordinary citizens, as opposed to donors and bureaucrats and department officials, participated in this particular form of nation building. And although we don't have those figures, we still can say that there was a commitment to an investment in engaging them. That is now beyond doubt. What is the culpability of the post-colonial state, as much as the one before it, in engaging in questionable collecting practices and exclusionary processes? The groundbreaking discovery of movable evacuee property, most of which had belonged to Muslims, provided the bedrock for East Punjab museums and archives. Is it ethical for museum professionals to ignore that opportunity or avoid shouldering the responsibility? Is omitting the acquisition story of Punjab's museum collections mere political expediency, condoned, or does and should it have implications or consequences? How does it affect our reading of the post-colonial state's treatment or appropriation of its other marginal communities, such as Dalits and Adivasis? I mean, these are not simply questions, they are pivotal questions for curators and art historians, both of and in South Asia, who are yet to interrogate their collections' post-colonial histories in general, those of partitioned regions in particular. But they're also questions that resonate with the concerns and issues that minority communities continue to face, other kinds of minorities continue to face in South Asia, certainly India today. That much of the academic literature on nation-state formation, citizen-making, governance, legal systems, that much of that is premised on how it dealt with evacuee property. What is the scholarly impact of these discoveries? But a nuanced view, this study, although perhaps an important beginning, must be expanded to include West Punjab, stretch to encompass divided Bengal, and consider undivided yet partition-affected Sindh. Over the last decade and more, several scholars have sought to shift the narrative away from high-level politics at New Delhi to middle-tier bureaucratic regions. Yet, as we've seen this evening, the ability to shape the events and outcomes of partition extended well beyond to include professionals like archivists and institutions such as museums. They were neither mere spectators at nor simplistic casualties of the Great Divide. In consequence, we've widened our perception of achieved the goals of partition and independence, and there exists scope to expand the roster further. The essential relation between historic objects, notions of belonging, and imagined identities is controvertible. More, it's evident that these links in the aftermath of a polarized partition continue to be imprinted upon the histories that we're able to write, the identities we can build of the region and the nation, and the narratives that they enable and disable. They depend on what we have in our museums and archives, who put them there, and why. Thank you.
Very much. Very interesting. Do we have any questions? Anybody? Yes, Norbert. Oh, yes.
Yes.
Invite you to make it even more so. Insofar as, I mean, you've outlined in remarkable which both the state appropriated materials from evacuees to imagine a new sense of belonging within Punjab. And in the various exclusions that entailed for the act. And I was wondering if you would comment on how the appropriating property was then re-narrativized by museums in the service. What were the rhetorical strategies that were taken to re-narrativize something which was effectively taken was Muslim? Maybe not all of it was, but you know, a lot of that was associated with an Islamic heritage, which was being rejected in the East Punjab at the same time. So there had some sort of double action that was going on, taking place at that, whereby Muslim property was being appropriated, and yet it's being re-narrativized in a way that made it less Muslim. And I was wondering, and you didn't discuss that element of the process. And I was wondering, say something about it.
Sure. Thank you very much. Official level, there was no re-narrativizing, there was just silence. I mean, no museum that I've visited in Punjab and that I'm aware of, even say 30 years or 40 years ago, anything about where these collections came from. Yes, there would invariably be some sort of comment about, oh, how I lost a bunch of things at partition to the Lahore Museum, and famously, series of Ragamala paintings that you can't quite work out actually the logic to how they were divided. So random set here, random set there. Anyway, so that kind of thing you hear, but there was no official narrativizing that I have come across that I'm aware of. In terms of the objects themselves, it's interesting. So as I mentioned, I didn't see, I find lists detailing. It'll say things like coins, manuscripts, books. It doesn't necessarily tell you this book, that book. Sometimes, yes, but for other kinds of collections, but not for the material that they're getting from evacuees. So if it's a named person that they're buying from, whatever, you might get a bit more detail. But so it's hard to tell what they were acquiring. But your assumption is a fair one. I mean, obviously, I needed to put in that caveat, but it's a fair one that a lot of it is of the region's heritage. And I think it's, from what I can tell, it's a sort of curious papering over, maybe what's inconvenient, or that's one aspect of it, i.e. you're just choosing to actively ignore that, because the thing that matters more is that those items speak to Punjab's history and its past, and so that imagined geography of Punjab outweighs everything else, and preserving one's connection to those roots, to these things, it blocks out any concerns about this being a Muslim.
Yeah.
So, it's sort of being a Muslim evacuee, or it being considered Muslim, because of certain kinds of things, manuscripts written in Urdu were considered to be Muslim. But at the same time, because the other sort of factor in the mix, just to make it more exciting, is of course the legacy of Ranjit Singh's kingdom, the court at Lahore, which is a cosmopolitan court. So they're writing documents in all kinds of scripts. So for that purpose, that kind of material becomes valuable. So it doesn't matter that you, in the next sentence, started associating Urdu and with Muslim culture. That doesn't matter, because what you want is that connection with Ranjit Singh's. That's powerful. Because also for the Sikh community, that's that moment of when we're an empire and we're cosmopolitan. So that tends to take over and be prioritized more than anything else. So if there is a kind of rationalization, it's not, my memory is that it's not explicitly framed as a rationalization, but that is the rationalization.
Does.
I push on this a little bit further. Exactly the thought that occurred to me, but in connection maybe with two of your own framings. Tom, you talked about colonial framings of regional identity and national history. And along the way, you refer almost on the cut 3 or 4 times to India's contemporary politics. So then the question is, given that, I obviously realize that the point of the paper is the major point is the fact of creation of evacuee property, the fact of the distinction then of between them and their original owners. But the question is what happens to them when they get left behind, and the story that they are made to tell. Given that the majority of them is books and manuscripts, the likelihood is that at least some of it is Persian and Urdu. If it's left behind by Muslim evacuees. And so the story that material then creates in these new archives and museums is one of a mixed heritage. How did that play out in the 50s, and how does it play out now? Is that yes? I mean, is that the story that people wanted to tell in 1940? Is it they want to tell now?
The primary story that I just to kind of go back to re-emphasize, the story that I think people are wanting to tell is about the greatness of Punjab. The fact that we have culture, make these beautiful things. We also have art, we have literature. So, kind of rehabilitating Punjab through that is one aspect of it. But the other aspect of it is related, which is the glory of Punjab, and relating back again to Ranjit Singh, because that is really a pivotal moment for them. These are not my words. This is just what I see repeated in the archive. And because Kashmir, which of course is disputed, because Kashmir was part of Singh's kingdom, and the British sold it to Hari Singh, etc. So in that sense, that kind of Muslim shared past is something one wants to own, because it means that Punjab included Kashmir. It was great, glorious, and the Ranjit Singh's kingdom. But those are the reference points here. So that tends to subsume any it's not to say that these other interpretations or readings don't exist, and I'm sure some people did see them that way, but in at least what I've been able to see in the archive, it tends to be every other consideration. It is about harking back to that great and glorious past.
To refer in one sentence to Randhawa, focus on pliability.
You're trying to get me to talk about, perhaps over a drink, I'm sure everybody's parched, but yes, of course, there is more going on, but it all relates to Punjab's.
Yeah,
great and glorious.
I find it fascinating that you're describing what's going on the ground, which is a division, a partition, is being worked into a narrative which is denying all that, which is reasserting a multicultural heritage in that. So while the partition is taking place, the government officials, so they're doing everything to make partition a reality, are trying to create a sense of a quite cosmopolitan, a very cosmopolitan cultural heritage.
That's the implication of what they do, but I don't think they're framing it in those terms necessarily, because I think at one level, it doesn't matter what your religion is. I mean, if you're a Punjabi, because all Punjabis are part of a big thing, and they have Sikh empire. So at that level, it doesn't matter. So what they're aiming for is clearly that period of that thing, Punjab's glorious past. So they're not thinking, oh, actually, we've got this great multicultural legacy that's what we should be foregrounding. That's not uppermost in minds. But as you say, it does have that implication if somebody step back and consider it. But this is something that you see we see in museums today as well. The spin you put on an object depends on your own interest, your own reading of it. And so that's what drove, I think, particular interpretation. And objects lend themselves to that. That's why they're reinterpreted, and should be perhaps, but. Anyway.
Ask you one more question. You in your conclusion, you mentioned as a further angle of research is the what's going on the reverse side in West Punjab. And one of the things that's you'll correct me, but one of the things that does something different in Punjab is that they had the Lahore Museum already there with a lot of material. So the pressures that was being faced in the West Punjab in whatever they were trying to create their museums was perhaps a little bit different than Punjab. And I was wondering if that created any form of the two did not necessarily, I was wondering if the two did not mirror one another, but in fact, because of the nature of the starting points from which they originated, whether there was some interesting comparison that one could draw from the fact that it was not, they were not exactly mirrored images.
So in East Punjab, there was a lot of effort that was going into collecting because, a lot of stuff. It's not that in West Punjab that there wasn't a similar effort in the sense that I can't remember the exact date, but I think 1951, the Museum Association of Pakistan, 49, the Museum Association of Pakistan is formed. And they're immediately sending out appeals saying, our duty to, as a great nation needs to have we have to know our great past and appealing to people who collect. So that is going on. I don't know enough, didn't have access. This was something I was in, didn't have access, wasn't able to investigate, through documents and correspondence and archival records exactly what was going on. But the problem in West Punjab, and with having a museum per se, collections, it presented a different kind of problem, which is how do you rationalize all Hindu, Buddhist, Jain stuff. You know, we're ideologically, we've created our own country because we want to stay for the Muslims of the subcontinent. So it's really interesting, the kind of the creative way in which the historical community as a whole, and by that I mean archaeologists, museum professionals, historians, members of the public, you know, public history is not new in the sense that, you know, non-professional historians or people in allied fields are also very much part of this conversation and this process. And they work very hard. They come up with ways of incorporating this material evidence of a non-Islamic past into Pakistan's national story. That is a discussion for another day and a whole other paper, but that is what's going on around this time. There are a couple of people who are doing interesting work on it. I'm thinking mainly of Andrew Amsterd's. I don't know if you've come across it. But also, of course, Ali Kazmi and people like that. But yeah.
Right, go on. I just you said restitution was certainly, it was out of the question. I just wondered, in this day and age of restitution as a topic, has it gotten to the surface? Is it an issue? Is it something that people even discuss, or is it allowed, you know, flounder at this side?
So So two answers. For me, the importance of this discovery was in terms of how do I put it? It was to prompt self-reflection as someone who worked with the Indian field. You get a lot of hits and bother about the colonial experience, and of course all of those things are true. Yes, we should get, you know, all sorts of things back here. Was Tiger anyone? You know, so that aspect, but also equally within that kind of national framework of talking for things back, we tend to prioritize blingy stuff, if I may say. So the kind of elite, the kinds of objects and collections with lower value, lower status items, it tends to be source community negotiating with, you know, museums and things. It's not national governments that, you know, that get worked out about the Arcanap collection at Cambridge, for instance. That's the source community approaching and negotiating those processes. And so that's one aspect of it, that why is this complete very different approaches to different kinds of things, but equally we're totally unaware that the things that the colonial state of having done, the post-colonial nation does the same. Yeah. The question of restitution between the two countries also falls victim to this business of privileging elite and higher status objects. So there's usually, I think, every decade or 15 years or so, there'll be some newspaper article about dancing girl in Mohenjo-daro, or we should really have a, you know, karate. So that kind of thing. Yeah. But not, I mean, a lot of these things will be personal possessions, and I mean, handed down or inherited in families with religions. That's not what people tend to spotlight when these kinds of discussions, if they come up. Of course, they're strictly dismissed, and of course,
it doesn't happen at the lower level.
I mean, it doesn't happen at the higher level, certainly.
Yeah.
But I think at the lower level, at an individual level, there's more scope. And there are possibilities, they're genuine, but it requires the, you know, people who are in charge of the collections to find the bullets, but they then are in most of it government collections, and then automatically curtailed and constrained what you can do. So that's the reason why, I mean, I'm both optimistic and I'm not optimistic, in the sense that the realities on the ground will make it difficult, but I'm optimistic just because I think that objects have that power to forge those connections, and I do continue to believe in that despite this story.
Right, well, I think we will stop there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody online.
Thank you very much.
I'm very glad that the Zoom worked. Yes, thank you very much. Yes, it's a keyboard worked. Okay, thank you very much.